afford it would choose not to place their school-age child in a learning pod during the COVID-19 pandemic. I call upon the Honorable Prime Minister to introduce the government's case in a speech not to exceed 7 minutes on their honor. Hear, hear.
Okay, so if everybody's ready, I will be starting my time now. Okay, so first off, the government team is going to be providing some definitions and resolution analysis before we offer our weighing mechanism and go into our two main contentions. So firstly, we're going to offer some definitions for this round. Firstly, we want to define the idea of pod. We believe that the idea of pod in this resolution implies that we are looking at in-person learning for those pods, similar to like bubbles of learning where they're having a few individuals, tutors to educate their students. Moving forward, just to offer some analysis on the resolution, the government team offers the analysis that we should be looking at education pods or bubbles, which are formed when primary education is occurring online through the public school system with whatever school system these students are attending, out of the concern of these parents that education would not be as good as their private tutors that they're hiring through these bubbles or pods. Moving forward, the weighing mechanism that we propose for this round will be virtue ethics. So basically, just a quick explanation of what virtue ethics is. Virtue ethics is an ethical system that teaches individuals to commit actions that are virtuous, actions that benefit society, rather than acting in what would be like a net gain manner, which would be similar to utilitarianism, or acting based on a set of rules to do what is right. According to deontology, you are instead specifically trying to do what will be the most virtuous possible for society. This means that it teaches others. Yes.
This is a question about the model at the beginning. What is the age range of the students we're talking about? Just because like different type of students like different things we need to discuss. So we just like have like a specific age range of the school age.
We're specifically looking at like school age students, so we're looking at kids probably ranging from like, like K through 12, just school range students. Okay, so if that is clear, I'll be moving on with my explanation of virtue ethics. Okay, so just really quick, it's teaching people to work towards benefiting others rather than just and working towards a higher goal rather than specifically looking for mere selfish gains. We are also trying to promote virtues such as equity and altruism and the protection of others. So just simple things along those lines. So with that, I'll be moving into our first of two main contentions for this round. Our first contention is about equity. What we can see is that equity in education is defined as the ability for all students to have access to equal educational opportunities. This means that every student, regardless of socioeconomic status, race, or anything else, has the same ability to receive a quality education as everyone else. What we can see as a result of these tutoring pods is that we can see that wealthy individuals are able to set up their own ability to have education and tutoring. And this is especially limiting to only wealthy members of society, because hiring a tutor for an entire year will in most cases end up being up to $104,000 annually. So we can see that it's very expensive for parents to set up these tutoring pods for their students. We can see that parents must pay the system to be able to join in, otherwise everyone else is left with the regular education system. And we can see that these tutoring pods will create educational systems that exclude others and ultimately harm equity. We can see that also wealthy parents are disproportionately the funders of education. Currently, schools are desperately underfunded by our government, and we can see that taxes, as a result of taxes being cut, and this is even becoming more severe in today's day and age with the COVID pandemic, because we can see that this year there is a 15% drop in state tax revenues as a result of COVID-19, and we are seeing hundreds of thousands of layoffs with no chance of relief in sight, meaning that schools are even more desperate to receive funding, as they are seeing a drop in their funding from taxes, where schools generally receive that money. So we see that they are more in need of donations in order to keep running. So what we see after that is that because the upper class is fiscally conservative and can skew, so they are not going to want to put their money both into trying to benefit the public school systems that their children are not attending, and as well as these tutoring bubbles for their students for their own children to be attending. What we see here is that because parents will not be depending solely on a public education system. So we will stop they will stop sending their donations to those systems, and public schools will ultimately run out of money. We will see a rise in charter schools, which will additionally increase this problem because charter schools tend to take funding that is intended for public schools. So we will further see an elimination of public school funding, where the majority of students in the United States receive their education. And the impacts of this is that we are basically seeing a new era of segregation, of educational segregation in the United States, especially because we can see the wealthy in the US are disproportionately white. What we can see here is that equity is ultimately being harmed because students are being excluded from their right to an equal education based on things that are outside of their control, namely in this circumstance, their socioeconomic class. So what that means is ultimately not virtuous, but it'd be more virtuous for parents not to engage in this because it would increase the ability for them to, it would increase funding for public schools and allow for everyone to receive an equal and quality education, whereas this is preventing many from receiving a quality education. Now moving on to our second contention, which is about illness. What we can see is that rich students and rich people in the United States as a whole are less likely to fall ill as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The wealthy have been shown to be disproportionately asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, and even if they are not, they tend to have the funding necessary to be able to receive quality treatment to combat this deadly disease. What we can see, though, is that though these wealthy students are likely to be healthy no matter what, their tutors and the people that they interact with are not so likely to be. Tutors tend to be of lower income. They are either A, college students who often are forced to live in group housing and lack other sources of income, making them more susceptible to illness and more likely for them to spread illness to others, or B, teachers, which tend to skew much older and are thus even more susceptible to illness and less likely to have, again, other sources of income to be able to support themselves were they to fall sick with COVID-19. So what we see here is that we increase the risk of tutors and teachers falling ill as a result of COVID-19 because of these education bubbles, especially because their students may be asymptomatic and spreading the disease to them, but without their knowledge and without any precautions being made because they're just simply not aware. What we can see is that beyond just the tutors potentially falling ill and even dying as a result of this pandemic, we can see that they are likely to spread disease to others. And even the students are more likely to be infected because they are just simply interacting with more people than they would be with online school. So we see an increased risk of disease spread, not just amongst tutors and students, but also with all the people that you have to interact with on a daily basis, like going to the grocery store and buying things and all of the other things people have to do just to like survive. So what we see here is that they are more likely to spread disease to others. Again, this is going to disproportionately hurt poorer people, especially because poorer people are more likely to hold essential jobs where they are still forced to be out in public. So what we can see here is that ultimately this will be less safe for everyone. It could potentially result in hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths if parents make these choices. And what we can see is the safest option is ultimately just stay in these online schools so they cannot infect people. Now the impacts of this is that equity is again going to be hurt because the poor are once again going to be falling ill, while the rich are able to remain healthy and receive medical treatment if they do fall ill. So ultimately, it's not going to be virtuous and does not fall under our standard of virtue ethics. So we promote parents instead not engaging in these education bubbles. So for these reasons, I strongly urge a affirmation ballot. Yeah. Point of clarification or point of POI?
It was a POI, but I think it's out of time.
I am out of time. Yeah, so I can't do that.
Timing. It's my fault.
You're also in protected time, so the POI is out of order. Before we continue, if all debaters and judges could go to the chat, Tab posted a link. I guess there's a naming convention for elimination rounds for how you name yourself on your Zoom video. So it says debater, your name and your pronouns or something, but just go into the chat, click the link, read that really quick and amend it. Apparently it's top priority. Okay. So it looks like just Mr. Palawal, can you confirm that? Okay.
Yes, I'll be the leader of opposition. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So in that case, I thank the Prime Minister for their relevant remarks, and I now call upon the Honorable Leader of the Opposition to introduce the opposition's case in a speech not to exceed 8 minutes on their honor. Hear, hear.
Okay. So wait, should I give it? Are you fine with off-time roadmaps? Like, yeah. Okay. So I'll talk about framework. a little bit of like more modeling, just to sort of talk about like what does it actually look like to be in a pod, and then op case, and then I'll refute gov case. Okay, start now. Okay, so side government comes up here and tells you that we as a parent need to use a virtue ethic framework, right, to base all of our actions off of. I think like a lot of issues with this, but I think the primary issue is that side government just does not tell us what is virtuous and what isn't, right? They give you like a little bit of analysis, like, oh, benefit society. So what is their framework actually? It's saying parents should act as if the framework is net benefit society. They are not using virtue ethics. They're defining virtue ethics as net benefit society. We don't get any real analysis, right? So I'm going to tell you what our framework is and why the actor should use it, right? Because the issue with their framework is, yeah, they can tell us a framework, but if they don't tell us why the actor should use that framework to guide their actions, there's no reason to buy their framework, right? We say that a parent should use a framework of net benefits to kids. There are a couple of reasons for this. Like the first being that like you have a principal duty to protect your kids, right? You brought them into this world and therefore you're responsible for their safety insofar as they wouldn't even exist without you. But not only that, like in terms of your parents' point of view, right? Like in your mind, you have a strong emotional connection to your kid. So like if your kid gets harmed, you as a parent are like mentally hurt, right? Like it hurts you in your mind, in your mental sphere. But thirdly, right, like in the future, like in the long term, most likely, assuming you're a good parent and assuming that you're thinking about using a learning pod, we're going to assume you're a good parent. In the future, when you are old and retired, your kid is going to have to take care of you. So if you don't do what's best for your kid, you're also not doing what's best for you, right? So we think like there are a lot of reasons for why a parent should care the most about their kid, but like the primary one is that principled reason. The thing is like you brought your kid into earth, you have a responsibility to take care of them, you have a legal responsibility to take care of them, but also just like there's a principled reason, right? So I think like there's a lot of good analysis for why like really the framework should be net benefits for your kids. But like I'll debate under both frameworks. I'll humor their virtue ethics framework and explain like in the terms of like I guess net benefit society why it like literally just doesn't matter, right? Your impacts are marginal. So if you like value both frameworks, like in the end, because the net benefit society doesn't matter, like you're not really changing that too much, and like your kids are getting benefited a lot, you should still vote opposition. Okay, let's go into a little bit of the model, right? And, I want to be really clear about like what a learning pod is, because like my little brother is in a learning pod right now. So I think like they misframe sort of what a learning pod looks like, right? So first of all, Judge, they tell you like it costs $100,000 a year. That's the total cost. Like when you split it among families, it doesn't cost that much for this rich parent, right? Like, and more than that, right? Like just because you are a parent that can comfortably afford it doesn't mean like a poorer family can't request to be a part of it and you can cover the cost. You can't cover the cost for them, right? So like if you evaluate under virtue ethics, there are certain like modes of like acting in which you can still give poor people accessibility to learning pods by covering the cost for them because you are a parent that can comfortably afford it. And if you're evaluating under virtue ethics and you want to do the best for everybody, you can just help pay for people who want to take it who are poor and can't afford it. But not only that, right? Like I think the big issue here is that with a learning pod, you don't stop funding public education. You still pay taxes for it. It doesn't count as private school. What a learning pod does, it takes the public school curriculum, but you hire a tutor to teach that curriculum in person instead of virtually to your kids. And usually it's like a group of 2 to 3 families. At least that's the learning pod my brother is like taking school under, right? So my parents are still paying taxes. Their money is still going to the public school system, right? They didn't just simply stop it and like defund the public schools during COVID. They are funding the public schools and also paying for a learning pod so my little brother can go to it. Okay, let's go into our case, right? And so our first argument, right, that there's low risk of COVID. And so it has this clash with the second contention, which basically like there's likelihood of like the rich person getting COVID and it's spreading, right? Firstly, like let's like talk a little bit of their analysis. They tell you like rich people are more likely to be asymptomatic. This makes absolutely no sense. Like what makes a rich person genetically predisposed to being asymptomatic more than like a poor person? Like I don't think I buy this analysis. So I think like realistically, they both groups are like equally likely to be asymptomatic. Okay, now let's talk about like why is there a low risk of COVID in a learning pod? So like first of all, right, you as a parent are choosing a group of 2 to 3 other families who also don't want to get COVID. I think it's important to note that like when you go and do a learning pod, right, like you are still worrying about your child's safety, and especially like as a parent who wants the best for your child, you don't want them to get COVID. Insofar as that is true, like it's likely that like even in your learning pod, you're gonna put in rules like everybody wears a mask, like my brother has to go wear a mask. They use sanitation when they go to learning pod. You have to have social distancing at the learning pod. Like the differentiation that you have a teacher in person speaking to the kids and capturing the attention of the kids, right? It's not like you just like ignore all safety guidelines, like hug the teacher who's teaching the learning pod, right? Like there are COVID guidelines that are still in place. So I think like a lot of their analysis about like why you're likely to get COVID in a learning pod is just not true. Because if you have like 6 to 7 people like in sort of like an open aired out setting that are socially distanced wearing masks and like sanitizing their hands, realistically, you're not getting COVID, right? So like, I think like a lot of their analysis here is like, there's basically like a marginally low risk of COVID, like no more risk than like if you go out to grocery shop. And so yeah, like maybe under the virtue ethics framework, you just shouldn't go out shopping for groceries because it's dangerous and you could get people sick and it's unvirtuous. Like you shouldn't prefer like feeding your family to like maybe harming some people. I think like there is a situation where like if the risk is low enough, it doesn't matter, right? It's not affecting your virtue. Like there are certain daily things you do that like, yes, there's a risk of COVID, but it's okay. It's not like a significantly high risk of COVID. When you go out driving, there's a risk that you cause a car crash, but you still drive every day, right, Judge? So like I don't think like I buy this analysis that like it's unvirtuous to like have this like marginally low risk of COVID. And under like our framework, I think it's like really clear why we win anyways, right? But more than that, let's talk about like education quality. And like, let's also do like a little bit analysis, like what type of teacher we're choosing, right? So like they come up here and tell you, you're choosing to be a young college student or like an old teacher, right? It's like, let's talk about a young college student. It's unlikely that you choose a young college student mainly because you want to make sure like the teacher is like actually good. So like really what we're talking about is like, you look through some teachers that like left their job, right? Because like whatever happened at school or like they are not like employed right now. And you like hire one of them to tutor your kid. Realistically, if they tell you, right, that a teacher is old, right, and they're at high risk, realistically, that teacher is probably not going out and getting COVID every day. So like, yes, an old person is a high risk of getting impacted by COVID, but old person also is not at a high risk of getting COVID, right? Because like they're not going out and getting themselves sick. And especially because you get to choose the teacher, you can make sure that the teacher you choose isn't going out and putting their own life at risk, right? Because you can make sure that a teacher has good reviews, like is like a trusted person who like you will like who like basically won't go out and like break like whatever promises they make with you. Let's talk about education, right? But they sort of like seed this educational impact. They basically seed that like if you do a learning pod, you're gonna get better education than like if you have virtual learning. But I'm gonna give you some analysis so you can sort of get like a magnitude of like what the increase in educational quality looks like. The thing is that like when you have fully remote school, you have literally no check on whether the student is doing their work or not. When my little brother started out doing virtual school, there's no way we as like me doing my own schooling, my mom, my dad doing their work, had time to make sure that he was doing all his calls during the day. Realistically, there's low engagement because where are you doing virtual school? On the same devices the kids are playing video games on the same devices the kids are watching Netflix on. So realistically, when a kid is alone in their room with an iPad, what are they gonna do? They're likely to waste their time and not actually focus on learning. Why is this bad? This is bad because school education, primary school education is really important to build the building blocks for a successful child in the long term. And what ends up happening when you don't make sure that they're actually fulfilling this work every day, you end up building bad habits and on the long term, harming their quality of life, right? And so in the end, we see that they basically see the educational impact. So there's this big impact on your student's life. There's a reason you go to school 8 hours every day. It's because school helps prepare you for the real world. And by taking that away from your kid, you are harming them to a large amount. I don't think it's virtuous for a parent to ignore their kid and basically say, allow my kid to like have a bad education, right? That's not a virtuous thing to do for a parent. I say it's a very immoral thing to do for a parent. And if anything, under a virtue framework, it's terrible for a parent just to throw their kid out and let them figure out their own education. They should be doing something to help them. And that's what a learning pod is. A learning pod ensures educational quality for your students, and it ensures that your student doesn't get COVID while still getting the human relationships they need to sustain their mental health during this these terrible times. And for that reason, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for their relevant remarks, and I now call upon the Honorable Member of Government to extend the government's case and speech not to exceed 8 minutes on their honor. Hear, hear.
My name is Tucker Otumi. I pronounce him, and I'll be the second speaker for the affirmation on this round. Let me first give a brief off-time roadmap. I will be going over brief observations about the negations case, going over framework, then going over the negations case, and then the affirmations case. I will signpost over the course of that case. Is everybody ready? My time starts now. So first, an observation about the negations case and their warrants. The negation asserts, without proof, that there are guidelines in place, that there is educational quality, that teachers are not going out and getting COVID every day, that old people are not high risk, and that the education is better. And yet, the negation provides no warrants, no evidence, that is, and no logic to back up the truth of these claims. And the negation, furthermore, provides only empirical evidence to support their entire case. Their entire case is based on the fact that the first speaker's brother is in a learning pod. Judge, I can walk up here, say that remote learning has been the best period of my education, that learning pods will actually harm my education, and that getting COVID would be the most harmful thing at all, and that, say, my brother was in a learning pod and got COVID 100 times. And there is no way to prove affirmatively the truth or untruth of this statement.
Point.
So, Judge, you must discount all of the negation's claims solely on this basis because they have no sources, no facts, no logic, and nothing. We are policymakers, not car salespeople. We need sound logic to back up our case. Now, onto framework. So the Wang mechanism is virtue, but the negation says that we do not tell you what is virtuous. And yet my partner said that, so virtue ethics is not utilitarianism, not deontology, not consequentialism. It is benefiting others and to create a higher goal, not selfishness. It's an ethical system that teaches individuals to commit to a higher loyalty. It teaches equity, the protection of others, and other thing. And so we gave examples, we gave definitions, we gave facts, and we gave logic. Everything the negation lacks. Then, furthermore, the negation outlines net benefits to kids. What you'll find is that we outweigh on this based on the impacts of coronavirus infection. But even past that, Judge, the negation must not run a framework that restricts evaluation of the impacts to a certain group of people. Perhaps this is a foreign policy round. I could say net benefits to the United States as my weighing mechanism. And so for this reason, we should bomb foreign countries to extract their oil because it is a benefit to the United States. That is an example of why we must, as policymakers, have a holistic view of the impact of our actions. We have a duty to all of society rather than just to children. Yeah, I'll get to your point at the end of this. So then contention number one, equity. The negation says that this is the total cost and that poorer families can request to join. This is speculative, Judge. They provide no logic to show why they would want this to happen or why richer families who the negation concedes are fiscally conservative and do not want to spend their money, so don't let them respond to it in subsequent speeches, want to subsidize the education of poorer people when they do not themselves directly benefit from it. And then the negation says that they still pay taxes, but here the negation displays a complete lack of understanding of our case. Yes, the negation may still pay taxes, but there's been a 15% drop in state tax revenues. There have been hundreds of thousands of layoffs, even with tax revenues. They completely concede this. They also concede, Judge, that there have been hundreds of thousands of layoffs and how parents will be less likely to donate to schools that they attend when their primary source of education is through tutoring bubbles. So, Judge, what you'll find is that if we institute tutoring bubbles, we will enter a new sordid era of educational segregation in the United States. The negation did nothing to refute these impacts. Yeah, and then second contention, illness. They concede that the rich are less likely to fall ill. They dispute our link about asymptomatic cases because, well, first, all of their evidence is empirical, but they say it's simply not true when the rich have better living conditions, fewer pre-existing conditions, and and generally are more healthy as a group, and so they're less likely to fall ill. We read this in our first speech, and it was completely dropped. So then they talked about how being able to choose teachers means that you won't get college students, you'll instead get teachers. Yeah, I don't think the negation will be paying too much attention to the risk of these teachers getting COVID. They'll pick the best teacher, an experienced and thus older public school teacher.
Point.
And so they concede that these teachers are older, underpaid, and often now unemployed. And they concede that these people have an increased risk of falling ill or dying. And they concede that online tutoring does solve for all possible educational harms, and that online education is good. Yeah. So also, sorry for jumping around the flow. I have been responding to the affirmation case, but now let me respond to the negation case. So the negation says that so the negation says that they will look through teachers who have left their job, and that realistically these teachers are not going out and getting COVID every day. They have no reason to prove that these teachers are not going out and getting COVID every day. They have nothing to, and they completely drop our analysis about how these teachers are likely to be older. And the fact that they look for teachers who have left their job indicates that these teachers are in an unstable financial situation. And then they say that old persons are not at a high risk for infection, but there is, of course, no way to trust them. And then finally, on their point about how there was no way to check on whether the student is getting work under online education, parents can do this. Homework as an institution already exists, and parents already keep their students in check on it. And teachers can monitor it with online assignments. Now your point.
I have a lot of points, but my main one is, how do you reconcile your argumentation about how there is no difference between the educational quality, right, of virtual versus what's it called, a bubble learning, with the you're literally the predication of your entire virtue ethics framework, which is that you're creating educational inequity. How do you reconcile those two arguments with each other?
Well, one, we are saying that we are reducing funding to public schools, and if there is, so what that means is that public schools will get worse if more people move to tutoring bubbles. It's basic logic, everything that the negation lacks. Now, for this reason, we strongly affirm the resolution. This house, as a parent comfortably able to afford to do so, would put their student in an educational bubble. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the member of government for their eloquent remarks, and I now call upon the honorable member of the opposition to extend the opposition's case in a speech not to exceed 8 minutes on their honor. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Take that as a yes. Okay, so in this speech, I'm going to go over framework contradictions, observation about GovSide, and then into the Gov case, and then into ours. So let's go over what the government comes up here and tells you, right? They tell you that we have ignored logic and reasoning, and that we ought to view this round as policymakers. But I think it's important to note that we did give analysis. We did give analysis about how parents want what's best for their child, and I think every parent should agree to that, and that parents do care about the safety, especially, and the education of their children. They're going to want, especially if they have the money to do so, they're going to want to invest into their child's education, make sure that there's COVID precautions when hiring a tutor, and hire the best tutor possible. And I think this is important to note, because in this debate, we're talking about this house as a family that could comfortably afford it. We're not talking about this house as policy makers of the US federal government. No, we're talking about individual families that really do care and have an emotional connection to their children. So now let's go into their framework, right? GovSide tells you that we want to evaluate this round in basis of like virtues, but they don't tell you, like my partner mentioned, what these virtues are specifically are, insofar as they say like we care about these arbitrary virtues and don't give you like any analysis as to which virtues they care about the most. I think it's more important to look at what they specifically said, right? The only mechanism that they gave us to specifically evaluate what a virtue is actions that benefit society. And we think that like that is basically essentially the same as like similar to our model, in which we're talking about like net benefits to a kid, but we also don't think it's like particularly reasonable, right? If everyone always did everything according to what would be like the net benefit to society, then like it would be too much of a burden for like any specific family to think of, and it's like not reasonable for any family to think of it in that way. But we're still going to prove in this debate how we still have like a net benefit onto like society, but we think that it's more important to consider what the parents would think of, because that's what we're talking about in this debate. And we also have to consider the fact that like on the opposition side, we're being more realistic, right? The government side comes up here and tells you that like we're expecting like conservative rich families to like all of a sudden care about like poor people and like all of a sudden care about equity. But I think it's important to note that a lot of these families that wouldn't donate or aren't even in the that are like in this specific mind frame won't even care about virtue ethics and are likely sending their kids to private schools anyways, which doesn't have an impact on like lower income students. So then let's get into this large contradiction that we see on government side, right? Like my partner mentioned in his POI, firstly, we see that government side tells you for two things, right? Firstly, they tell you that if you don't send your kid to a learning pod, then you're going to have a better education. They tell you that like learning pods don't have like a better education, right? And then they tell you that like you're going to have a large inequality and inequity, because if you put your kid in a learning pod, then they're going to have a better education than other kids, and therefore that's a bad thing. We don't think they can say these two things at the same time because it contradicts each other, and we think that they should take one stance or the other. Let's go into their first contention, right? Their first contention is about equity, and the only link that they have to like benefiting equity is the fact that wealthy people are likely to like donate and help schools. And firstly, a few responses. So firstly, we would contend that like donations don't really matter in terms of public schools. What matters most is the taxes, and insofar as like rich people generally have better houses, they tend to pay a lot more in taxes towards these public schools because they're still living in these public schools, because this is a temporary move and they're still planning on putting their children back after like COVID subsidizes. That means that they're still going to keep on paying taxes and live in the same area, and they're not going to try to make that school worse because they're still going to send their kid to that same school afterwards. Now let's consider like why we think like in the end equity doesn't matter as much as like government side proposes, right? We think that like on our side as a family, you would rather have like your kid have a slightly better education than everyone else having a terrible education and your kid participating in it. We don't think that has like any benefit to like society or like any like remote benefit to like your kid as well, because you ought to consider like your kid and the value of their education over the ones of like other students. So let's go into like why we think that we still have like some sort of equity on our side, right? We tell you that like one way in which families that really care about equity, they can still do that by hiring a tutor and involving other students, particularly their kids' friends that are lower income, and letting them be a part of this learning bubble. And we think this is a particularly big impact insofar as that these parents that are like well off that are still in public schools are likely willing to like spend money and to help these kids, especially if those kids are direct friends of their child, and they would be willing to do that, especially because their kid is not going to be in school, they're going to be in remote learning and not going to have that much interaction. They're going to want their best friends to be in the same learning pod as them, and if their best friends are lower income, then they're likely going to be willing to pay for those things. So let's go into their second contention, right? Their second contention is about illness, and they give you this analysis about how like rich people are less likely to fall ill due to COVID. I don't think this is true. What's true, the reason why we give you this is false is because like there's literally no evidence proving that like rich people have like better genetics to like get rid of COVID. What they're referring to is the fact that like poor people have less of an option to go to hospitals after they get sick. That doesn't mean that rich people can't get sick at the same rate as poor people. If anything, we see that like rich people are getting sick at a higher rate because they're able to like go travel during vacation time and like gather in big parties in which they're able to like have a lot of COVID infestations and cases. That's why we see that like rich people oftentimes have a higher likelihood of like having COVID. So now let's go into like this idea of whether or not like college tutors and teachers are more likely to get COVID. Like we've provided analysis like throughout in our entire case. We tell you that like every parent wants the best for their child. They're going, especially if you're already well off, you're going to investigate into that tutor. If you find out that the tutor is involved in like activities that are dangerous and like involved with non-COVID precaution related activities, and you're likely going to fire them, right? Because you still have like money to be able to find a new tutor and like tell them that like you care about these things. And if anything, we think that there are many options, many great teachers for our side to consider, especially because when we consider that a lot of teachers have actually quit their jobs because their schools have not aligned to COVID concerns. If anything, this is more of a reason for your student to be in a learning pod so that they're not affected by these cases. So then let's go into their responses to our case. So going back to our first contention, I think our first contention pretty much like is in opposition to their second contention. We've told you that like when you place your child in a learning pod, you're much more less likely to get COVID because you're able to monitor who and what direct relationships are being affected by your child. If you have like, especially a lot of elementary schools are already going like full in person, you're not able to control exactly like who your child is interacting, whether or not their families care about COVID, and you're more likely to get sick. To our second contention, they mentioned the idea that like, firstly, they tell you that you're going to have a better education, but they also bring up the equity point, right? We think that like, if anything, we benefit equity more because if you take your child out of education, then the teacher that is in the school with the students that can't afford to be in a learning pod, then that teacher can focus more on those students, right? Because then there's less of a resource split. You're still paying those taxes. Those kids get a better education and your kid does too. And for these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the member of the opposition for their eloquent remarks, and I now recall the honorable leader of the opposition to rebut the government's case in a speech not to exceed 4 minutes on their honor, reminding them that while new examples are welcome, new arguments are not. Hear, hear.
Okay, so my order, I'm gonna talk about like frame, obviously, then I'm gonna do like some like actor analysis, and integrate that with like weighing under the frames. So I'll start now. Okay, so I think like a big issue with like the framework provided by like side government is like they're literally only reasoning for like why we can't make the framework like net benefits to students. Like you cannot like basically take away some impacts. Like I think it's totally fair that in a resolution which places you, the house, as the parents, says that you should act as a parent, right? The resolution is making you the parent. The resolution is not saying this is how parents should act. This is saying as a parent, what do you think you would do? And insofar as that is the resolution, the most rational framework for this round is act like a parent, care about your kid, right? That is what parents care about. Come on, like, we were being realistic. That's what parents care about, right? And so like the burden is now on the government team to explain why should parents care about virtue ethics? And they just don't do that, right? You cannot buy their framework insofar as they don't give you a reason for why parents are going to act under virtue ethics. That is like the biggest issue with their framework analysis, right? And like furthermore, they just don't differentiate virtue ethics from like net benefit society. Like virtue ethics isn't net benefit society. Virtue ethics is acting as like a moral character. It's very different. And if anything, under virtue ethics, a parent should care about their kids. That is the most morally right thing to do. It is virtuous to take care of your kids. It is virtuous to make sure the people you brought into this earth are benefited the most because it's your responsibility. You brought them into this world. Okay, and it's way too late for them to respond to this analysis. They had to respond to it in MG and they just didn't. So like, I don't think they're allowed to refute this. I think you're evaluating under our benefit, our framework of benefiting the child under virtue ethics, like in the reality of virtue ethics, or under, right, like our net benefits of the child. Now let's talk about weighing, right? And we have basically 2 points of weighing, right? You have just educational quality, you have COVID, like a lot of mitigation happens on both. We'll see what ends up happening, right? And so like, the issue with side government is they don't respond to our actor analysis of the parent, right? In their MG, they basically tell you, Judge, oh, there were no warrants. All he used was examples of his son. Integrated with the examples of my brother, I told you why the parents act this way. Parents care about the quality of their kids' life. They care about their kids' risk. And insofar as they care and they want to make sure their kids don't die, what will parents do? They will make sure that in the learning pod, there are the necessary precautions to minimize the risk of COVID. When you're separated, socially distanced during the learning pod, when you wear masks, when you sanitize your hands, the risks of getting COVID are no more than the risks of getting COVID when you go in grocery shop. right? I don't think it's any more of a risk than that. But moreover, right, they also do this like conflation of the risk of getting COVID and the risk of like the impacts of COVID, like once you get COVID, it harming your health. The issue is the risk of getting COVID is no different. And if anything, it's lesser in like, right, in a learning pod and compared to like a normal person, because you get to pick the people in your learning pod. You get to pick the teacher. And therefore, because like as a parent, you get to choose who you're working with in that learning pod, you get to choose the teacher you hire. You can pick people so that like they don't go out and party. You can pick them so you have trustworthy people who have said that they aren't going out, they aren't putting themselves at risk of COVID. So the thing is like the COVID risk is like really minimal. But the thing is, they don't respond to the educational quality argument, right? They don't respond to like a lot of my mechanisms for why educational quality is significantly harmed. I tell you, Judge, about like kids requiring social interactions to have a reason to go to school and care about school, both with their peers and their teachers. They don't respond to this, right? And basically that means you flow it through the round. Because kids interact with their teachers and they like care about them and respect them, then they have an incentive to work hard on what their teachers give them. If you have no connection with them because you're just seeing them through a screen, you don't have that, right? Moreover, they barely give you a response to my argument about how like it's unrealistic that parents are going to be able to check on their kids. They're telling you that when parents are working their, let's say, 9 to 7 job, especially because they're well-off parents who are rich, who are probably working high hours, that they have time to take like 30-minute breaks to go check on their kids and make sure like the kids are doing everything they're supposed to. And they also have time to read up on all the documents of what their kids are supposed to be doing in virtual school. Because the thing is like teachers send out like a bunch of documents to their the parents, like the list of like all the activities. We don't think it's realistic for a parent to check on this. And realistically, like in the end, when you're in person, the teacher can report to the parent, but when you're online, it's a lot harder for the teacher to connect with the parent. There are a lot of issues with online schooling with the ability to make sure that kids actually do their work. That is where the educational harm comes. You have no social interaction, you harm the mental health, you harm the ability of the kid to focus in class, you get worse education. They concede that in their PM, and then they forget that they conceded that in their MG. And so in the end, when the only differentiation between both sides is really this issue of who gets better education in the sector of these kids who are doing pod learning, you have to vote opposition under either framework, because in the end, the COVID impact is like super minimal. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the leader of the opposition for their eloquent remarks, and I now recall the Honorable Prime Minister to rebut the opposition's case in a speech not to exceed 5 minutes on their honor, reminding them that while new examples are welcome, new arguments are not. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Okay, so if everybody's ready, my time will be starting now. Okay, so one of the fundamental points that we need to make in this debate is the affirmation team is advocating that is basically arguing and advocating that everyone matters, while my opponents are simply saying that they only care about the rich. What we have to understand here is that we should be proving the value of virtue ethics, because quite simply, rich people and everyone else has a duty to all of society. You do not get to just choose to care only about yourself, but quite frankly, people have a job to be benefiting society and not only caring about themselves. My opponents make, and I'm quoting here, the claim that we're suddenly expecting rich fiscally conservatives to support equity. But quite frankly, why shouldn't we expect this? Why shouldn't we expect the wealthiest members of society to be making sure that society is beneficial and equal for everyone? And ultimately, I'll be showing why I win under both, because quite frankly, educational losses for most of society will harm everyone in the end, even the rich people who received a better education on their own. So with that, I'll be moving into our first of two main voting issues, which is about falling ill. What we have to understand here is that the rich tend to be healthier. My opponents completely concede our analysis that the rich are less likely to have pre-existing conditions. They are more likely to have better living conditions, and they are more likely to have the money to treat their illness. So what we can see here is that they are much more likely not to have severe cases of COVID, and they are much more likely to be asymptomatic. And even if they don't, they can receive medical treatment that most others cannot afford. Furthermore, we can see that tutors are not as likely to be this. They can see that tutors are likely to be old and more likely to fall ill as a result of COVID. All they say is, well, parents can check for if tutors are going to be sick or not, but they're completely missing our entire analysis here. In fact, they even say themselves the rich are more likely to fall ill because they're partying and going on vacations, which is exactly our point. The rich will get COVID, they'll be asymptomatic or have mild symptoms, and they will pass that disease on to their tutors. We cannot guarantee that social distancing will be enough. We cannot guarantee they will even social distance, even if my opponent's one example shows that in this one specific time they social distance, and there's no guarantee of that overall. And besides, being online will ultimately be safer than any kind of social distancing. And furthermore, we can see that we are only looking at online schools, contrary to what my opponents are saying, because they conceded our analysis that pods and that pods, and we are specifically looking at the comparison between educational pods versus online school. This is specifically what we are looking for. Moving forward, we can see that the impacts of this is that we can see large-scale infections across the United States. Not only do we see tutors potentially falling ill and potentially students, because this is, again, putting them at higher risk because they are, again, interacting with people that they otherwise wouldn't be. So what we're seeing here is that we are basically preventing a potential disaster that could result in thousands of deaths because those tutors will interact with other people, those students will interact with other people, and potentially result in hundreds, if not thousands of people falling severely ill and dying as a result of a pandemic. This is an irreversible thing. My opponents say, well, maybe their education will be a little bit better for a short while, but ultimately we can't change death. If thousands of people die so one student can have a better education, quite frankly, that's not worth it. Moving forward, our second voting issue is about being educated. What the affirmation fundamentally believes is that everyone deserves an education. Educational funding has decreased. We have seen a drop in taxes, and my opponents have conceded this analysis. What we can see is that we are looking at a drop in education, a drop of funding for these because taxes have decreased among everybody but the rich. They also drop our analysis that fundamentally the rich are the ones who provide a significant number of donations simply to keep schools running because taxes are not enough. They don't address our analysis whatsoever about the fact that schools do not receive adequate funding, especially during these times. Yep.
You never gave this analysis that rich people donate to school systems. And I mean, maybe you did, maybe the judges heard it, but I didn't hear it, so I just wanted to PO it.
I said it in my first speech.
The chair will take the point under consideration. The government can continue.
Okay. I'll start my time now. Okay, so what we can see here is that education is being hurt for everyone, that we see a rise in charters, as I said again in my first speech, which will further harm education. So we see the public school system's quality decrease dramatically. Now, the harms of this is that, so what we see here is that even if my opponent's claim is true, that even if a few students receive a better education under their system of educational pods, the vast majority of students will be hurt. They say that it'll be counterbalanced because there'll be a few less students in class, but quite frankly, the rich, as I just said, are the minority of the population. There'll be like 2 students less in class. That won't be enough to counterbalance the severe harms that they are serving to the school. Because while they make up a small portion of society, they make up the bulk of school funding. So what we can see here is that everyone will be hurt because everyone is hurt when society is less educated, including these rich students. So it is in the parents' favor under their weighing mechanism to help everyone get an education. And ultimately, it is creating a less equitable society because not everyone has a right to be educated anymore. Only the wealthy do. What we have to understand here about this round as a whole, as I said at the very beginning of this speech, is that the affirmation fundamentally believes in equality and rights for everyone, while the negation believes that only the rich deserve health and education. And so for those reasons, I urge a strong affirmation ballot. Thank you.
Okay, I think